Welcome to Castle Hill. Let's take a moment just to centre on God before we begin our thoughts for this week. Holy God, holy and true, may you hold our whole lives as we hold on to your promise in these strange times. May we have eyes that see deep enough to find you among us, within us, between us. Holy God, holy and true, in word and in silence, may we hear what is ancient and new in stories we tell, and the silence we hold to hear deep enough to know your presence among us, within us, between us. So be it. Listen for a word from God, first from the prophecy of Isaiah. Here is the message which God gave to Isaiah, the son of Amos, about Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain where the temple stands will be the highest one of all, towering above all the hills. Many nations will come streaming to it, and their people will say, "Let us go to the hill of the Lord, to the temple of Israel's God. He will teach us what he wants us to do. We will walk in the paths he has chosen. For the Lord's teaching comes from Jerusalem. From Zion he speaks to his people. He will settle disputes amongst great nations. They will hammer their swords into ploughs, their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will never again go to war, never prepare for battle again. Now, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light which the Lord gives us." And just a few verses from the New Testament, from Colossians chapter 3. As a result, there is no longer any distinction between Gentiles and Jews, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarians, savages, slaves and free, but Christ is all, and Christ is in all. You are the people of God. He loved you and chose you for his own. So then, you must clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Be tolerant with one another. Forgive one another whenever any of you has a complaint against someone else. You must forgive one another just as the Lord has forgiven you. And to all these qualities, add love, which binds all things together in perfect unity. Amen. My thoughts this week go to a subject which has fought its way through the focus that has been very much on COVID-19 and has managed to find the highlight in news bulletins across the world. And I'd ask you to think of that as to how it applies to Scotland. Jewish Rabbi Jonathan Sachs told a story at the end of last year about a couple of Jewish children travelling on the London Underground when a man whom they did not know came up and for 20 minutes he harangued them in the most anti-Semitic way. When someone tried to intervene, that person was threatened with violence. And then a young woman confronted the man and with calmness told him that he was wrong in what he was doing. We're not told exactly what she said, but it was enough to distract him and to calm him. The woman was a young Muslim wearing a hijab. Her name was Asma, and she herself had been on the receiving end of racist abuse, as increasingly more in our communities are now facing. But what Asma chose to do was not let that intimidate her, but use that experience to identify with the Jewish family that day. We'd call that brave. We'd even call it heroic in some way, in standing up to what was happening. But you know, the very fact that we describe it in such terms, and that is still a story that happens in the 21st century, shames us and should be deeply shocking. And there is a version of faith, something alive in every faith, be that religious or political faith, where we actually believe the world is better when we are all the same. A belief that identifies one nation or one faith or one group as being more significant than the others because of culture or power or history. To walk on that ground is as old as humanity itself, and to speak of such is even older than speech itself. To find ourselves still doing so when philosophies of the centuries, when histories of all religions, and the prophets of our faith long ago shaped words and ideas and morals that were meant to lift us up from such base places, inviting us to see God in the breadth of humanity rather than in its self-identifying similarity, disappoints us as much as it should shock us. The Old Testament is not always known for its generosity towards other nations, and yet those passages we can almost recite from the prophets, especially from music, that we read time and time again, have the most astounding universalist, one world view of humanity. And interestingly, it's these parts we remember more than all the others that are able to quote. The people that walked in darkness, let your light shine, wonderful counselor, and so many more. Because perhaps, let us believe, these ideas do still appeal, despite our faith's frequent choice to turn a blind eye to prejudice and racism, and the gutter level of our press and some of our politics. These still inspire. They still offer us hope. They are still that corrective to where we so often end up in our faith and in our politics, and the shallowness that these institutions can become. Listen to the prophets, we plead in these times. Voices that have something better to say, something positive and life-giving to offer, because they themselves have been there. They have known the prejudice as a nation, as a religion, and they warn what the experience can do if you choose to respond like for like. Asma, in that story from Jonathan Sacks, used the abuse she knew to identify with others receiving abuse and change the kind of relationships that she could have with other people. This is the humanity the prophets call us to, the ethic they identify as lifting us up and out of fear. For fear is always so much part of our fall into prejudice and racism. And the prophets speak with great clarity for our time, not scared to call out Israel as much as any of her neighbouring nations, not to respond in kind, in hatred towards someone. And Isaiah sets the scene for this highest one world way of living and way of identifying ourselves in the dramatic image of swords being beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Isaiah says that which we use to put down, it may be physical weapons like swords or spears, or it may be the power of words. That which we use to put down another may be an instrument of war, or it may be words of prejudice and racism. But the way we rise up in our humanity, the way we identify more closely with what God is to reshape these instruments, repurpose our words, take that fear we have of the other and use it to identify with the fear they have of us, and change the way that we engage and relate to each other. No longer in fear of another, but recognizing their pain by identifying our own and changing the kind of relationships that we have. That reading is one we frequently begin Advent with, that universalist place, identifying with the abused, with the stranger, because it's a time that leads us to another story of incarnation, that of God identifying with us, and that new relationship of a love that knows the pain of prejudice and the corruption of power through anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and far too many other contemporary ways that we lessen people. A love that uses that pain to identify with those that still receive it. That's incarnation, a love, a God who identifies with that. And that's a story we need to shape as a church for our new normal, found in the prophets, who give us a choice, an invitation to turn and walk in the light of the Lord. As a church, as a congregation, we are called to be agents, prophets of change, who turn swords to plowshares. Rarely is that nowadays about weapons. Far more it is often words. To recreate all-inclusive relationships within the breadth of our humanity, taking the fear we have, the abuse we may have received, and using that to identify with others, not always like us, but who have experienced 21st century rejection of any kind. And if we can't do that, dare we, in St. Paul's terms, call ourselves the church? When things get weary, we can turn to God for comfort, for peace and restoration. In the quietness of our conversations, God listens. God knows us. Today, this week, may that which is worrying us begin to drift away and allow a healing and peace to take over. May we hold on to that peace as God holds on to us. And may we feel drawn to a new belonging to God and with each other, even in the distance of these days. So be it. Take care and stay safe.